My name is Mark Blyth. I am the director of the Rhodes Centre for International Economics and Finance here at the Watson Institute at Brown University. And I'm going to tell you how this came about, because it's just a great story. You're going to love this, right? So before I introduce Paul, let me explain the following. One of the things that the Rhodes Centre does is to try and promote research. And one of the research projects we have is with Professor Sayori Katara and also Professor Aditi Sahasrabudhe. And they were doing a workshop that happened to be on the dollar. So this is on the docket for like months. We know this is coming up. And then at some point, I start doing my class, which many of you hear from, right? And as my class will attest, it's all about the dollar, right? So, this is a dollar's a thing that's coming along. And then the next thing that happens, it turns out Sayori actually knows Paul. Now, anyone who's in this game knows Paul Bluestein because he writes the books that we all wish we could write. His book on the IMF, for example, is just an absolute classic. It's fabulous work. So I was like, yes. And then, of course, he happens to be writing a book on the dollar, which is like, suddenly I felt like a Sith Lord where you go, there's a vergence in the Force. It's all coming together all at once. I thought, we have to get Paul here, right? So then we do this thing where it's like, he's coming from Japan, he's going to the West Coast, he's going to Princeton. How do we get him from Princeton to here, all the rest of it? And just, it was Keystone Cops level stuff because have you ever dealt with Philadelphia Airport? You know where I'm going, right? Have you ever dealt with American Airlines? Right, you know where I'm going. So we got him an Uber from Princeton down to Philly, and he gets there, and he goes to Terminal A where he's meant to go. And they say, no, it's not here. You've got to Terminal B, which is international, makes no sense. So then he goes, okay, so he goes to Terminal B. And they go, no, you're in the wrong terminal. And then when he goes back, basically they're like, well, it's your fault because you didn't show up in time. So then we strategize, and he figures it out, and he's been on a train all night from Philly. And got here at 9 a.m. I think he's had about an hour's sleep, right? And maybe not even that, right? But I just force-fed him a double-shot coffee and a sandwich. Hopefully this is going to keep the man going. But I really want to thank you for just making a ridiculous effort to be here. And thanks to everyone for showing up. Now, the formal introduction. Paul Bluestein is a senior associate with the economics program and Scholl chair in international business at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's written about economic issues for more than 40 years, first as a reporter at leading news organizations, and later as the author of several critically acclaimed books. A graduate of the University of Wisconsin and Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar, he spent most of his career reporting for the Washington Post and Wall Street Journal. His books chronicle international financial crises and major developments in globalization and trade. His sixth book, published in September 2009, is Schism, China, America, and the Fracturing of the Global Trading System, prescient as ever, 2019. And he's working on a book which is now out about the US dollar. And without further ado or any more introduction, Paul, the floor is entirely yours.
Wow, what a kind introduction. Thank you very much. I really needed that after being on a train all night, I got to tell you. But I did manage to get an hour's sleep, and I think my brain has been diluted into thinking, into feeling like I've had a normal night's sleep. But anyway, thank you very much. It's really an honor to be here at Brown. And I'm really grateful to Professor Katara and to Professor Blyth for inviting me to come and talk about my book. So I'm going to say something very strange for the author of a newly published book, recently published book, which is that I hope it's wrong. I don't think it's wrong, but I kind of wish it were wrong. I kind of hope it's wrong, and for reasons that I will explain in due course. Now, when I say I hope it's wrong, I'm not talking about sort of the guts of the book, because the book is not a polemic. It's a narrative. It's a story, really, about first how the dollar got to be the dominant global currency, and some of the episodes there I'm old enough to have covered, like the beating down of inflation in the early 1980s. I was covering the Federal Reserve for the Wall Street Journal at the time, and I write that this is maybe perhaps the most significant policy step taken by the U.S. government that ended up bolstering the dollar's role in the global economy, because it enshrined central bank independence. And then there's a chapter about the major currencies that have been putative rivals to the dollar and why they were thought to be viable rivals and why they turned out not to be. And then there's a couple of chapters on the weaponization of the dollar, its use in sanctions, U.S. government's power to deprive targets of access to the dollar system, how that works, how it developed after 9/11. And then a couple of chapters on the evolution of digital currency and crypto and CBDCs and all that, and what implications those have for the dollar. And then there's a couple of chapters on more recent events like the COVID, the pandemic, and the financial crash that happened then, and what that means for the dollar. And then, of course, the sanctions that were imposed on Russia in February of 2022. So all of that, I hope the experts among you, if you read it, you will find that it's accurate. With maybe a couple of with a couple of small exceptions. But I hope it's readable. But that's not when I'm talking about. I hope it's wrong. I'm talking about what you might call the central premise of the book. And this is the central premise, and these are the exact words that are used in the book, that I think the doomsayers about the dollar are wrong, that the dollar's dominance is almost impregnable and will remain so barring catastrophic missteps by the U.S. government. Now, at the time I wrote those words, they seemed fairly uncontroversial to me. But I go on to say, somewhat more controversially, the dollar weapon can maintain potency long into the future, even though some targets of sanctions, right, notably Russia, have found ways to limit the damage. That's the central. As I say, I hope that's wrong. For reasons I'll discuss in a little, I don't think it's wrong. Now in my defense, given all that's happened recently, I think I couch all that by saying, look, this doesn't mean that the U.S. should be complacent about the power that its currency confers, because first of all, the danger of a catastrophic misstep is, quote, hardly trivial. Okay, and as I was working on the book, I was trying to use my imagination as best I could to think of possible catastrophic missteps, and I came up there could be a battle royale in Congress with the extreme right wing using its ability to block legislation to raise the federal debt limit, and that would lead to some kind of prolonged default on Treasury securities. Was one that would have a pretty big impact on the dollar. There might be more severe attacks on the independence of the Federal Reserve than occurred under the first Trump term. There would be the shredding of the rule of law, which certainly happened to some extent during the first Trump term, and to the point where investors would be concerned that the impartiality of U.S. courts would be, really no more reliable than Chinese courts. And tensions between the U.S. and China, whether it's over Taiwan or over trade or whatever, might reach such a dire situation that there would, the decoupling would occur at a level that's, I think would be horrific for both countries. But anyway, that could happen. So perhaps the world would end up in two blocks, one dominated by the dollar, one dominated by the renminbi. Again, I'm just using my imagination here, trying to think of, and then finally, because the Trump family has, it's all of its entrepreneurial spirit, has gotten into the crypto business, the crypto industry, and all three Trump sons. Maybe that not only Donald and Eric, but Barron as well, have become orange pilled. That's the lingo. I'm sure all you young people know what orange pilled means, right? And somehow this would lead to an upending of the fiat money system. Okay, so that was my best effort. Well, it turns out I was not very good at catastrophizing. It turns out that you know the line in Hamlet Act One. So to paraphrase that line from Hamlet, it turned out that there were more things in heaven and earth than were dreamed of in my philosophy. Or to use the vernacular, the vernacular you see on social media. It turned out that my bingo card was missing some pretty significant entries. So things that really boggle my mind. The trashing of relationships with U.S. allies. Now, I mean, no one expected Trump to be a great ally, but they did. But I think I don't. Did anybody here expect him to in his first 100 days become the economic enemy, or threaten to become the economic enemy of our allies? No, I didn't see that. The Liberation Day tariffs, I'm sure for this group, I don't need to enumerate what I'm talking about here. How shambolic and extreme and poorly conceived doesn't do it justice, does it? The chaotic policy swings since then, the assault on rule of law, which for people at an Ivy League college, I don't need to enumerate, and more recently, the attack on unfed independence. In the immortal words of Professor Blythe, the world has decided that the United States doesn't know what the hell it's doing. I think, am I quoting you exactly? Is that, yeah, that was really good. I didn't expect that. Any of things to be, at least certainly not to the drastic extent that we've seen. And so the result has been these series of commentary, news articles, which I'm sure, since you're in this, those students are in this course, you've seen a lot of these. I think I've got the headline in there, or the one that quoted Professor Blythe, saying, well, this is really going to be trouble for the dollar, right? I think I find a lot of that commentary to be very sensible. And on the mark. I do think that there has been a bit of heavy breathing, which I think is important to point out. Which is that it's not that not that the denunciations of the impact of Trump's actions is off base, but that there's this idea that's been cited in a lot of the articles and commentary that this is the first time that anyone has ever raised doubts about the safe asset, the Treasury securities as safe assets. This is the first time that anybody sensible has raised questions about the dollar's dominance. Well, let me tell you, when you do a book about the history of the dollar's dominance, you find a lot of examples of people. And so here's, this line in this column, which just appeared, I think, about 48 hours ago in the Financial Times. Let's see, what's the quote? I can't read it on here. It feels wild to be discussing all this. For years, banging the drum for dollars serving its role as dominant reserve currency was a niche hobby for crackpots. No. People who are, in my view, definitely not crackpots have made rather similar comments in the past. I've come across a lot of them over the 55 years since the end of Bretton Woods, since the early 70s, when the dollar became a pure fiat currency and President Nixon severed the last vestiges of its links to gold, right? There's been a lot of episodes. And so here's three. I want to, one of them is by an article written by myself when I was at the Washington Post in 2005. Look, that was a period, and I know many of the students here were not paying a lot of attention to articles in the Washington Post about the blowout in U.S. current account deficits, but that was raising a lot of concern about the prospects for the dollar. And I quoted, and I got at the front page of an article about the U.S. trade deficit, quoting a guy named Bill Klein at the Institute for International Economics, saying, sooner or later, the rest of the world will decide the United States is no longer a safe bet for lending more money. And there was a lot of that kind of commentary at the time, and I believed it, and that's why I wrote, that's why I wrote that article. Now, more recently, during the first Trump term, there was a great deal of commentary, again, by people who are I mean, I've learned a lot from reading Ishwar Prasad is I was at Brookings for a while. He's a, great scholar on the dollar. And he had a column in the Financial Times. You can see the word. You can all read that, right? I won't go into it. And then there was another column by Dan Driesner at Tufts, making a similar point. Again, I've learned a lot from Dan Driesner about sanctions. And they're saying, look, what Trump is doing is for the first time we're really worried about the dollar. Okay, and notice that this dollar strength could prove fleeting and could change rapidly. And Driesner says its loss of the privilege status will start slowly and then accelerate quite rapidly. I mean, we've been hearing a lot of that lately, right? So this is not the first time by a long shot that we've been hearing that kind of talk. Now, so am I saying that, this is just another one of those episodes where people get upset about the dollar and it'll just be a lot of sound and fury signifying nothing? Am I saying that? No. I think this is really an episode. However, this is one of the last things I wrote in my book. In late November of 2024, Yale University Press, the publisher, said, "Okay, this is it. No more changes. The book is going to the printer." And funny little story. I had submitted 3 endings to the book: the T ending, the H ending, and the X ending. The T ending was if Trump wins. The H ending was if Harris wins. The X ending was if Harris actually wins, but Trump, claims that she didn't. The T ending was used. So I had to, this was in my T ending, and I wrote, "Dollar supremacy survived Trump 1.0, and I believe it will survive version 2.0 as well." Well, I'm here to tell you, I still think that's true. I continue to believe that. I fully acknowledge that all the things that have happened that I've just been talking about are I'm going to need to put maybe if I come out here and I'll be able to read the words better. I mean, I fully acknowledge that that these actions have battered the pillars of dollar dominance in ways that have not happened before. And this gives new incentives to foreigners and to people and to market participants to look for alternatives to dollar assets. They already had a lot of foreign governments already had incentives to look for alternatives because of the weaponization of the dollar, and now they have even more incentive. But that doesn't mean that the dollar will be dethroned. And I have 2 reasons for that. First is that the alternative currencies have a lot of shortcomings. And the second point is that the dollar's role as the key currency for international transactions is so deeply entrenched in the global financial system. I'm happy to say that the papers that I've read for the conference that's being held here very much have really reinforced and in very good scholarly ways reinforced both of those points. But let me give you my take on them. Now, whoops, I'm going in the wrong direction. So I want to focus on the second point, right? The first point I made was that about the rival currencies, and there's been a lot of good commentary about that in the media lately, and I'm happy to talk about it. But as the papers for this conference have, as I say, have reinforced my view about that. I'm going to focus on the second point about the dollar's role as being so deeply entrenched, because I don't think that has been sufficiently covered in a lot of the popular commentary about what's happened recently. So it's not just the things that you hear a lot about when you hear about dollar dominance. These 3 charts are compiled by the Federal Reserve of New York. Maybe you've seen them before. These show the metrics that are very commonly cited, right, about dollar, right? The one on the left shows the dollar's predominance in foreign exchange reserves held by central banks. Of course, the blue line shows the dollar. The middle one shows the dollar's use in export invoicing, which is essentially means it's trade. In trade in all regions of the world, the dollar is dominant, except in some intra-European trade, where countries that use the euro for their own currency use, they do use the euro. But basically, the dollar, really is the main vehicle currency for export invoicing. And then over on the right, you see the dollar's predominance in foreign debt issuance. If companies and governments issue debt in currencies other than their own, the dollar is by far the currency that they tend to issue debt in. The other metric that's very commonly cited, because it's quite dramatic, is the dollar's role in foreign exchange trading, right? The dollar accounts for something close to 90% of the in all foreign exchange trading, because you can't really trade currencies that aren't the dollar easily with each other. If you want to trade the Chilean peso for the Jordanian dinar, for example, you trade Chilean pesos into dollars, and then you trade dollars into Jordanian dinars, right? So those are the metrics that are commonly cited, and they're quite remarkable. I mean, I think they're striking, but that isn't the only reason why I'm making the case that the dollar's dominance is entrenched. Oops. Now, when I was doing research on this book, I had quite a few aha moments where I said, "Oh boy, the dollar's dominant. Oh, it's really powerful." The data shown in this chart. This is when I had my biggest aha moment. This is when I was really blown away. And this is the only chart I have in the book. Everything else is just words. There's a picture, but everything else is. I'm happy to say I was able to do it just with words. But this data really blew me away. This is data that was compiled by the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. And what those lines show is a market. I don't know if have you talked about the foreign exchange swaps, Mark?
A little bit.
Okay. So this is so maybe you've seen this already. I'm sorry. Okay. Well, maybe I don't need to explain it, but let me, for those who haven't done the homework. So what this shows is this gigantic and rather obscure market for foreign exchange swaps. This is not central bank swaps. Okay. Don't confuse the two. But this is a market in which two parties will swap currencies with each other. Let's say the dollar and the yen. It could be the British pound and the euro, whatever. And first they trade at today's exchange rate, and then they trade at a future exchange rate. They swap back. And the point is just to hedge. This isn't speculation, right? This is just to protect yourself against movements in exchange rates. And these are the people who participate in this market. They are the biggest players in the global financial system. I mean, these are people who really throw around enormous amounts of money. They're insurance companies, they're pension funds, they're asset managers, they are global banks, global securities companies, treasury departments of multinational corporations. And when the BIS compiled this data in 2000, when they last did the survey, they found that this market, the volumes were $5 trillion a day. Now, so if you take that over a little more than 2 weeks, that's all of world GDP in a short period of time. Just the volume of trading in this market, that's how big it is. And the dollar absolutely dominates it. Okay. Now, this is not the same as FX trading. This is not the one I talked about before. This is a different kettle of fish. And so you see the green line rising over time. That's the dollar. Okay, and it's much higher than the other colored lines, right? The colored lines are for the euro, euro, yen, pound, and Swiss franc. The dotted line on top is the total for all currencies, so you can just ignore that one. So the dollar dominates, and it's because these huge players in global financial markets are using the dollar in all kinds of ways. So a good example would be a Japanese insurance company, okay, that invests heavily in dollar assets, but it needs yen when it has to pay its policyholders. Policyholders have they have an automobile accident or they life insurance company, they die. So you need yen. They want yen. They don't want dollars, right? But the insurance company wants to hedge itself against movements in the dollar yen, so they use the swap market. So that's the kind of a Swiss pension fund that needs Swiss francs to pay its beneficiaries, but it invests heavily in dollars. Okay, they use the swap market, and so these are the big. They're using dollars for lending, for borrowing, for investing, and again, these are the big players in the global financial system. Okay, so this, I argue, shows the depth of the entrenchment of the dollar in the global financial ecosystem in a way that those other more commonly cited metrics, they're very important. I think this really shows the depth of the entrenchment. So look, we can imagine a crisis of confidence is that people have been talking about with the dollar, right? Because of all the stuff that's happened in the past 100 days, the ineptness and the recklessness and a lot of cases, malignancy of policy. It's, just the other day, just this past week, Trump was talking about, we can have a big income tax cut because so much revenue is going to be coming in from the External Revenue Service. Right. Well, that doesn't bode very well for the outlook for U.S. fiscal policy, does it? That the president is talking that way. No, that's not good. And then, of course, he would put, combine that with implicit, with more pressure on the Federal Reserve, and you can imagine that there would be quite a big sell-off of Treasury obligations. Markets will demand much higher risk premia than they did before. That will drive up interest rates in the United States when the government has to pay more to borrow. Everyone else has to pay more to borrow. That'll be very bad, right? But would that significantly alter the U.S. dollar's role in international transactions? That's really the key question to me about everything that's happened and what it means for the dollar. And I'll be very interested if people can explain to me how all these types of all this entrenchment of the dollar could somehow be unwound. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm not 100% confident, but I think I'm right in saying I don't think that kind of sell-off of Treasury assets would affect the dollar's role in international transactions. Okay, so combine that with the role that's played by another institution that I don't think doesn't get sufficient attention in all the talk about the power of the dollar. Maybe I'm betting that in Professor Blythe's class you probably do, but for those who haven't done the homework, okay, I think the role played by CHIPS, the Clearinghouse Interbank Payment System, is not sufficiently understood in terms of the power that this gives the U.S. government. A lot of attention gets paid to SWIFT, right, which is based in Belgium and handles messaging. We've all, SWIFT codes. We're all familiar with those. And SWIFT gets a lot of gets a lot of attention. When Russia invaded Ukraine, there were people marching around with signs saying "De-SWIFT Russia," right? Because people thought that would completely choke off the Russian economy. No, messaging is important. It really helps the efficiency of transmission of funds. But SWIFT doesn't transmit funds. It just transmits messages. And I don't have to tell people, the age of college students or even graduate students, and I probably don't even have to tell people my age here, that, messaging can be done in other ways. But chips, it clears and settles. To be more precise, together with the Federal Reserve, it clears and settles. It has an algorithm that matches payments coming in from all over the world in dollars, and it's based in New York, so it's subject to US law. All the banks that transact on chips are subject to US law because they are subsidiaries of, some of them are US banks, but some of them are subsidiaries of foreign banks. They're subsidiaries of, French banks, Brazilian banks, Japanese banks, Chinese banks, but they are US based subsidiary and they are subject to US law. CHIPS processes on average, this is its most recent public disclosures, 540,000 transactions per day. Now, these are big transactions. These aren't your migrant workers sending their remittances home, okay? And the dollar amount is $1.8 trillion a day on average. And CHIPS handles more than 90% of the world total of dollar transactions crossing international borders. And if you're a foreign bank, you have to have access. There are a few that have figured out ways of getting around it, but it's very difficult. If you want to conduct international business for your customers, you need to do so in dollars. So if the U.S. government says, all right, we are targeting, this individual or this company or this country, whatever, right? Don't do business with them. We don't like them for whatever reason, okay? Foreign banks are going to be very, very wary of doing any business with that target because the consequence is that they will be cut off from access to chips or access to all the banks that transact on chips. It can be kind of, it can be tantamount to a financial death sentence, so banks don't do it. They're scared. And that gives huge clout to the US government. So yeah, look, I'm not saying sanctions are a silver bullet. They're not. We've all seen, plenty of evidence in the media and elsewhere that targets can find ways of getting around sanctions and wriggling through and avoiding and evading and all that. And in the book, I talk about, there's sort of two categories, right? There's the real low-tech ones, which I call analog. A classic example of that would be falsifying oil sales records. The U.S. and its allies tried to force Russia to accept it, or tried to impose a price cap on sales of Russian oil. Russia can't sell oil for more than $60 a barrel. But Russia was able to find people who would falsify the records. Yes, this is in compliance with that level. Now that's very low tech, but of course there are new ones that are more high tech, digital. And probably the most interesting one coming along is something called mBridge, which was developed by the BIS for cross-border transmission of central bank digital currencies. It's now being pretty much managed by the People's Bank of China, and that has possibilities. I'm not sure they will make a huge difference, but it's certainly governments have all kinds of incentives to develop these things. They had incentives before Trump 2.0, and they have more incentives now. But as long as the dollar remains the most used currency in international trade and finance, banks all over the world will need to clear and settle large payments in New York, which means that the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, which administers sanctions, is going to have one heck of a lot of power. By the way, don't you think that was great that I didn't make that origami dollar? I found it on the internet, but it's good, isn't it? Okay. Now again, my message is not complacency. Okay, I've just said that U.S. has all this power, but my message is not complacency. I argue that the Spider-Man adage, I'm sorry, this seems juvenile or sophomore to some of you, but it's a good adage, isn't it, right? With great power comes great responsibility. And I try to apply this to a number of aspects of dollar dominance. The one that's probably the easiest to understand, and maybe where it's one of the well, maybe not the most important, but it's certainly important, involves sanctions. So, I personally think that sanctions are sometimes quite necessary and desirable. I felt that way in February of 2022. Certainly preferable to the alternatives that were available to the U.S. government at that time. But sanctions inflict pain on poor segments of populations. There's a lot of studies showing this.
and innocent bystanders can be hurt, so the targets can be infuriated, and they can find ways of striking back and inflicting collateral damage on the world or on the U.S. The history of sanctions is riddled with examples of that. Now, the conventional wisdom about sanctions is that because the U.S. has been using them excessively, that this will erode the effectiveness because people will move away from the dollar, right? If you're going to use that on us, we'll just use other currencies. Well, first of all, I'm really doubtful about that. But even if it's true, I mean, it has a lot of merit. I mean, there's a certain poetic justice to it. But even if it's true, that could militate in favor of using sanctions very aggressively, right? Because if sanctions are a wasting asset, it's better to use them now while they're still effective instead of, restraining yourself and, in the hope that they'll stay effective in the future. It's better to use them sooner rather than later. This argument, the conventional wisdom, I get it, but I don't think that's the right way to look at it. I think the Spider-Man adage is a much better way of thinking about sanctions. Use sanctions if you can use them responsibly and in a way that actually achieves legitimate, national security interests of the United States and makes the world a better place, whatever. But don't do it if you're using them irresponsibly. I think that's a better framework. So, do you think Donald Trump is going to take the Spider-Man adage to heart and say, "Oh my gosh, I have all this power with the dollar. I better make sure that I use it with great responsibility"? Yeah, okay, me neither. So this brings me back to my point about why I wish I were wrong. Okay, I mean he's been using economic coercion. Now so far it's only been tariffs, his favorite tool. And he's been using. And I think the most shameful example of this is the way he's threatening. I'm going to impoverish you unless you agree to become the 51st state. I think that's the most egregious example. Well, we have to face the reality, which is that in addition to tariffs, he's got another very potent weapon at his disposal. I wish the dollar did not give him that kind of powers of coercion, but no good is going to come of pretending that it ain't so. No good is going to come of taking comfort in what I regard as fantasies that, the dollar weapon is about, it's on the verge of losing its effectiveness. I think that's a fantasy. I completely accept that foreign users of the dollar have have incentives to find alternatives and to disengage from the dollar system. It doesn't, but I think it'll be very, very difficult and costly and very time consuming, like years consuming and maybe decades consuming for them to do so. So I don't think my wish is going to come true. And that's a kind of a depressing note on which to end. So if you give a public remarks, you're supposed to end on a little bit of an upbeat note. So I'll just. That's my dedication. I take fiendish delight in it, and I hope you enjoy it too. Okay.
We're not going to run the microphones. You stand here and answer the questions, Ali, and I will run the mics. So, who wants in? Right now.
Hi, thank you. I'm sure you covered in your book, but can you talk about the potential impacts of stable coins and cryptocurrency on the U.S. dollar's dominance?
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned. I mean, there's two really different ones, right? There's the crypto that just flies around from day to day, hour to hour, minute to minute, second to second, and then there's stable coins. I'm happy to say I have a section of my book that I really loved writing, which and I hope the young people here might take the time to look at it, because it tries to explain what makes a dollar, and I would love to run through it, but in the interest of time, I'll just say, I hope you'll read it, because it's meant to deal with an argument that one hears an awful lot from people in the crypto space, which is that, okay, there's nothing backing Bitcoin, there's nothing backing Ether, nothing backing this and that and the other. Okay, maybe they're Ponzi's, but the dollar is a Ponzi. There's nothing backing it either. In 1971, President Nixon destroyed the last vestiges of the gold backing of the dollar. So there's nothing backing the dollar either, okay? And I go through a whole litany of ways in which the state and law and contracts and central banks and agencies of the government make a dollar and in ways that differentiate it from crypto. Crypto being the thing that's not tethered to anything, right? The idea that now I think it's entirely possible I mentioned earlier, right? The Barron Trump has been orange pilled. I've kind of joked about you can imagine this scenario where Donald Barron is such a smart boy. You say so yourself. He's so smart that he thinks that Bitcoin should become the currency of the United States. Why don't you do that? I mean, do I think that's going to happen? I think unlikely, but it's plausible, isn't it? Okay, so, but barring that kind of catastrophic misstep, I don't think crypto poses any threat to the dollar. I do think that if regulation is loosened, as appears to be happening, because the crypto industry did a very good job of buying control over powerful members of Congress, and this administration, the Trump family is getting into crypto. So I can imagine there being problems for U.S. financial stability arising from that. But now, stable coins are a more interesting question, and the Trump people and Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, and what's the guy's name, David Sachs, the crypto czar. They say stable coins. Stable coins are going to be spread all over the world. U.S. dollar stable coins, and that will help the dominance of the dollar. Well, first of all, I don't think it's necessary. The dollar is either going to remain dominant for the reasons I said, or it's not. Stable coins are not going to make a difference. And I have a lot of problems with stable coins. Two big ones. One is that they make it very easy for bad people to do bad things in transmitting money. Now, I've talked to people in the stablecoin industry who tell me, we understand that, we are working on technical fixes that will make it impossible, really difficult for those bad people to do bad things. And I think these are really well-intentioned people, and I hope it's true. But anyway, that's one objection. I don't think that stablecoins serve U.S. interests broadly conceived, because I think that they will make sanctions evasion easier, money laundering and other illicit financial transactions easier. But will it hurt the dollar? No, it won't. But the other big problem I have with stablecoins is what economists call currency substitution. If all these, crypto dollars, which people, legitimately think are worth what they purport to be, if those things are flowing into countries all over the world and being used as means of exchange, that's going to make it very difficult for the central banks of those countries to maintain monetary sovereignty, to control their economies, right? Now, some of them have a lot of difficulty controlling their economies anyway. And I feel, sympathy for people living in those kinds of countries. I did a whole book about Argentina, of the terrible crisis it suffered in 2001, and it keeps, but look, Argentina is moving in a direction now where there's finally some hope that maybe, I think I have my doubts, but maybe they'll get control over their monetary policy. And that's what Argentina needs. It doesn't need a bunch of, it's very nice for people who can have dollars and get their money out of the country and press an app on a phone and hit send and send their money flying all over. That's very nice for them, but it's not good for the economy. It's much better if they find a good way to stabilize the peso. So that's my other objection to stable coins. I do think that improving the technology of money transmission is, has, there's obviously a lot of good reasons. In the book, I come out for something called tokenized deposits, which are kind of a cryptoized version of bank deposits used for, to use. But anyway, I can talk about it. But very good question. As you can see, you kind of pushed a button.
Next up.
Thank you for the time. In other talks you've given, you mentioned the deep liquidity and credibility of the U.S. Treasury market as being kind of unparalleled in a tenet of dollar dominance. Do you see a strategic default, a la kind of the Stephen Moran century bond zero coupon thing, being a bit of a risk to that, or is it the same conclusion as the FX swap slide?
No, yes, I see it as being a big risk to that. Yes. I don't think it, it's plausible. After all, he is chairman of, when I finished my book, he was not yet been appointed chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. I had read his paper, I think it is a danger. And you've seen some of my other talks. That's how flattering. Yes, I have talked about the depth and breadth and liquidity of U.S. Treasury markets being really the unique superpower that the dollar has, right? That other currencies, the yen, the euro, the renminbi, they all have a lot of the advantages and features that the dollar have. Big economies. Japan has rule of law. Europe has rule of law. Britain has rule of law. They have quite sophisticated financial markets, but they don't have a market for one single government-issued asset like treasuries that are as deep and broad and liquid. Yes, I do think, yes, thank you. You're quoting me quite accurately. As I say, I'm flattered. But yeah, this administration seems to have some people who, who harbor, I think, fallacious assumptions about what dollar dominance means. They think it, and Moran, thinks it means bad things for the working class people in the manufacturing sector. I think it's a very marginal. So I think the premise that he has is wrong. But perhaps more important, I think that if the news media began to circulate stories saying the Trump administration is strongly considering doing what Moran has proposed, basically forcing a default on foreign holders of treasuries, you'd have a market reaction exactly as you had, what was it, around April 9th or something. And when Trump said people got what did he call it, the yip yaps or something? Anyway, he backed off. And my guess is that something like that would happen again. I think the markets would react very badly, and that would. And Trump has shown that he has feet of clay. Is that the right simile? I can't remember. But anyway, he's shown markets. He does pay attention to that. He has a crude, but not entirely unhealthy reaction when markets go haywire. So, but yeah, good point. The answer to your question is yes. Short answer, yes.
Over on this side. There we go. No.
I hope you pardon a naive question, but suppose the worst that happened. What's the practical impact to the United States economy if the renminbi were to replace the dollar as reserve currency? What would it look like?
Well, it depends how it happens. So, in my view, and I think this is a pretty standard view among economists and people in financial markets, that what holds back the renminbi, two basic things. One is rule of law. People concerned that if they hold renminbi assets, they have to worry about the impartiality of Chinese courts, because the Chinese, Xi Jinping has made it very clear that the Communist Party controls courts. I think China's made great strides in the past 25 years toward rule of law, but it's still it's still got a long way to go. The other thing is controls over capital movements. People worry that in a crisis that they won't be able to get their money out because the government will clamp down. So now.
Say it's not China though. You say it was the loonie.
Oh, I see.
What happens to us?
Oh, please. Oh, that would be so great. Who would be the loony? Oh, sorry. Okay. I see what your question is. Okay. Well, anyway, but just to complete my point about China, if China decided we will have rule of law and we will allow money to flow, we're not worried that our people are gonna ship their money out to protect it from Communist Party oversight. That would be wonderful. That would mean China was becoming a nicer place. 1/5 of the world's population would have, and it would be. I think personally, I think it would be good for China. I don't think Xi Jinping agrees with me. So if it happened that way, I think that would be a very good thing. But so what? And the dollar and the dollar. Look, there are. You've heard me emphasize in my talk about the geopolitical advantages that the dollar gives the U.S. Right? We can impose sanctions. I haven't talked about economic advantages. There's debate among economists about this. How much economic advantage does the dollar give the United States? And there's the exorbitant privilege school, and there's the exorbitant burden school. I'm really grossly oversimplifying. You've heard of exorbitant privilege?
No, this is my first time.
Okay, so exorbitant privilege was very much a thing for the United States when the dollar was the undisputed currency, central currency of the international monetary system under the Bretton Woods system that was established in 1944. And that phrase, exorbitant privilege, was coined by Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, the French finance minister in 1965. He said the United States has this unique ability because it has the dominant, it can issue debt as much as it wants in its own currency, and it can run big budget deficits and eventually big trade deficits. And I think that was very much true for a long period in U.S. economic history. But after the global financial crisis, it became much less true. And Ben Bernanke, the former Fed chairman, did a paper that I thought was really persuasive in 2016, saying, well, yeah, we've had exorbitant privilege in the past, but it's not very exorbitant anymore. There are a lot of countries that can issue bonds at even lower interest rates than we can. Last I looked, Greece was issuing bonds at lower interest rates than the United States and U.S. Treasury, because the interest rates that countries issue their bonds in is affected by a whole bunch of factors. Growth and inflation and investment rates and demand for credit and so forth. So lots of countries issue debt at lower interest rates than the U.S. Now there's the exorbitant burden theory, which is very much associated with Stephen Moran, the person, the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. J.D. Vance is very much in this sort of school that this is hurting my people, the hardworking people of the Midwest, because the dollar is dominant, its exchange rate is higher than it should be, and that affects the competitiveness of U.S. manufacturers on world markets, and so that's bad for working people because they. Well. Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think there's a little bit of merit to it. I mean, yes, the exchange rate is a little bit higher than it would be otherwise, but that isn't. U.S. policy has completely screwed up and failed the American working class. But that's not the reason. So that's my view. Now it's there is debate. There are economists who argue that there's an exorbitant burden. And there are economists who argue that the exorbitant privilege is still really big. My view is that they're both, there's pluses and there's minuses. I think the pluses outweigh the minuses, but it doesn't make a huge difference to our national, what really matters to our national economic success is a bunch of other things. But the dollar's dominance does give the United States great powers in the geopolitical sphere to use the dollar as a weapon, and I think that will continue. So, to take this point one step further, what if the dollar lost dominance? What if one of these really catastrophic scenarios really came true? I was asked this the other day. I was giving a talk in Tokyo, and someone said, "Well, look, suppose there's the pound lost dominance because of World War I and World War II. Suppose we have a war with China, and it's really bloody, and the world splits into two, and my answer to this is, well, we probably, dollar dominance would probably be affected. But so what? There's much worse thing. I mean, gutting rule of law. I mean, or keeping dollar dominance. I'll take keeping rule of law any day. Losing dollar dominance is. If you believe that U.S. dollar dominance is hugely beneficial to the United States, that the United States will lose the ability to run, to borrow money, it'll lose the ability to run trade deficits, and then losing dollar dominance could be pretty significant. But still, the terrible things that would have to happen are so terrible that losing dollar dominance is. It would be it's the least of our worries. So I think people sometimes lose perspective about these these scenarios. I wrote a book because I think it's important, dollar dominance. I do think it's an important issue.
I realize folks have to leave at 1 o'clock, so if you're going to bail out at 1, now's your chance for a bailout point.
Just to follow.
Do it all at once.
To follow that thought, Ray Dalio 3 years ago had pointed another potential mechanism to threat the dollar and dominance. Basically, he said, and the country has the dollar dominance has a curse because promote undisciplined overspending.
Yeah.
And also allow to accumulate enormous debt until the time of decline. So,
yeah, I mean, and there's something to that. And the dollar was blamed during the global financial crisis with some justification by the exorbitant burden people that it had led to excessive. All the buildup of leverage and so forth. Interest rates
were so low that Americans borrowed like crazy, you know, and they did. My view, and you know, again, there's legitimate debate about this among economists. I think that it contributed at the margin. Interest rates were lower than they would have otherwise been, and you know, the tremendous amount of money flowing in mostly from China, although Europeans were also investing very heavily in those mortgage-backed securities at that time. That contributed, but does that mean that that companies like Countrywide Mortgage wouldn't have been out there, you know, selling, convincing low-income Americans to borrow, you know, to take out mortgages that were far in excess of what they could afford? Does it mean that Wall Street wouldn't have figured out all these clever ways of packaging those mortgages and slicing and dicing them, right, and selling them as AAA rated securities? And does it mean that the rating agencies wouldn't have looked the other way and said, "Oh yeah, you know, AAA, AAA, sure, yeah." You know, would all those bad things not have happened? No, I think they would have happened. It might not have been quite as bad a crisis as we had, but I think we still would have had a crisis for the reasons that we did. So yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting point. I deal with it to some extent. There are pluses and minuses, yes, and that's an even bigger minus than the one that J.D. Vance gets all excited about, thinking that, you know, that it's hurting, you know, the working class Ohioans that he grew up with.
Is there a linkage between dollar dominance and the dominance of the capital market, U.S. capital market?
Yes, I mean,
So that would be something that we might be concerned about if we lose dollar dominance is the dominance of the capital market, or are they not linked?
well, I think they're linked in the sense. I think the dollar dominance, you know, comes from the dominance of U.S. capital markets. I mean, it's the idea that, you know, that the dollar would completely go away, you know, as an international, widely used currency internationally is so implausible. I mean, if U.S. capital markets are so drastically hit that we lose dollar dominance in the process, again, then dollar dominance is the least of our worries. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, me too.
Let me just jump in for a second, abuse my privilege. I'm going to put on my J.D. Vance hat for a minute and go back against this point that that's all crap, right? Because I'm going to give you a different version that isn't about the exchange rate, right? But the global imbalances issue is a real one, right? And it goes like this. So why is it the story? Start with Ray Dalio. America spends too much. America spends all that they just spend and all this debt. Who's buying this stuff on the other side of the trade? If it's so obvious that the country's bankrupt and is living beyond its means, who are the morons on the other side that are constantly buying this debt? And the story only gives agency to the United States. It doesn't do anything for Asian countries or anything else, right? So since 1997, since the East Asian financial crisis, all of East Asia has been running an export surplus against the rest of the world. Since 2011, the EU's been running a surplus against the rest of the world, and there's only one country running the deficit. Now, just work this out as a dollar exchange mechanism, as dollar recycling, right? So basically, you're an exporter, you suppress consumption, you suppress demand, you suppress your exchange rate. You earn dollars. You don't want dollars coming into your economy because it will push your prices and boost your wages and your exports will suffer. So you have to sterilize those somehow. So what can you do? You can buy US assets, but we won't give you the good stuff like pharma and tech. So what do? You buy another treasury bill. You literally take the dollars back and you hand it back to us and we go, great, we'll buy even more imports. And this has just been going on for the past 35 years. Now, it's not the working class in the Southeast or the Midwest. It's the entire economy. We noticed this when we got to COVID. We don't make anything. We import everything. And if you look at US manufacturers, the story that employments went down and outputs went up is pretty much a statistical artifact of the way that you calculate the computer sector. And you know this because you go to the export data. What you find is we import tons of machinery and tons of stuff that we no longer make. So there's an actual strategic national security problem that if you just keep running this, we're going to end up being Australia with nukes. No, I'm not saying I totally believe that story, but it's not just about exchange rates. And there is something in the imbalances thing that we really need to pay attention to.
Oh, this is the one part of the Stephen Moran argument that makes sense to me. And Besant, I think, is very much onto this, right? Is that it will be a good outcome of all this craziness with tariffs if we can somehow use it as leverage, particularly with the Chinese and perhaps with other surplus countries, perhaps with Japan, Korea, Taiwan, but most importantly of all with China. If somehow there can be an agreement to unwind the imbalances that Mark has just talked about. I think that would be that would be make the whole world much more sustainable. It'd be good for living standards in
China.
I totally agree. Yes.
One more question? Who wants it? We could probably do two more. I'm just saying one more.
Yeah, thank you. Building on Mark's point, so the working class that suffer from the deindustrialization that Mark has just described, they don't want this business to go on like it did. And so I think what Trump is doing is not exogenous shock, but endogenous to actually having a dominant currency, because those people actually suffer because he's reacting to a significant voter base that is actually suffering from the costs of having a dominant currency, which is deindustrialization, job loss, and everything. So if we don't please their demand, they'll continue electing those kind of people doing destructive policies. So how should we productively deal with their demands, which are not completely illegitimate, in my opinion?
Oh no, I think they're legitimate. Boy, is that a big question.
Please solve the last 40 years of errors in the next 4 minutes.
I'll recommend a really good book to you called Failure to Adjust by Ted Alden, Edward Alden, a former colleague of mine now at Western Washington University, I think, or something. It's about all the ways in which the safety net, the worker training programs, healthcare, education, all of these policies that could have been, if they had been handled much better, might have made it possible for people in that segment of the economy to adjust to all the forces in the world economy that were hurting them. I'm afraid Mark is right. I mean, you're talking about solving 40 years of maladjustment, but it's a book. The book is a little outdated. I mean, I can't remember when it came out. It may have been as long as 10 years ago, but it's really good, and I think it's still applicable.
Okay, we've got two more, one here and one here.
Can you say a little bit more about what the consequences of like a massive reshoring of manufacturing and reindustrialization would be for the question of dollar dominance?
So if the tariffs and all that stuff worked and we actually reshored and the exchange rate went down, what would happen to dollar dominance?
I don't know. This is a bit like if Santa Claus is real, isn't it? I don't buy the argument that reshoring of the kind of manufacturing that those were. You weren't talking about that either. Then
Well, I mean, I think perhaps not even sort of the sort of right-wing version of this, but I think people on the center and people on the left have also been making versions of this argument, the abundance kind of argument, the like we should build things again kind of argument. So maybe not like the full reshoring kind of argument, but the sort of reindustrialization. Like what would there be consequences for dollar dominance?
What would be the consequence? Well, I think it'd be good for dollar dominance. I mean, if we're prospering, it's obviously good. It'll be good for dollar dominance. I'm just deeply skeptical. I mean, I think the pooch has been screwed so badly already by what has happened in the past. Well, what happened on April 2nd, Liberation Day, in case you've forgotten.
I was liberated from 10% of my retirement.
If only you had more to lose.
This is the remnants of the Kool-Aid. Sorry, what was that?
If only I had more to lose.
I just don't see how the end result of all this. I think Bessent is in the fray, violently trying to achieve that kind of something like a deal that would involve the kind of rebalancing that we were just talking about. That he maybe for the same reasons as that Ray Dalio talked about and that Mark talked about, that could be a real win-win. The problem is that what were those tariffs? I mean, they were saying to countries that had already had trade agreement, signed in blood, saying, never mind, you can't trust us to, and you particularly can't trust me, the president, because when I wake up on the wrong side of the bed, I decide to just destroy these things. And it appears I have the power to do so. No one will stop me. So why would anyone believe that they ought to reach something as far-reaching, as something that would really restructure? I mean, I don't see how we get from A to B using that, using that kind of approach. But if it worked, I think it would be, if it worked in the way that Mark was talking about it, I think it would. Why wouldn't it be good for the role of the dollar? Just because dollar dominance has in many ways contributed to those imbalances doesn't mean that unwinding them would make the dollar, a dollar asset's undesirable. I think it would enhance their attractiveness.
Bringing it home.
Thank you for the talk. You brought up the foreign exchange swaps, I think mainly as a way to demonstrate the entrenchment of the dollar in international markets. But I was also wondering if you see it as a way of sort of maintaining stability in terms of exchange rates as well, or like how the sort of entrenchment of the dollar has the effect of maintaining stability as well.
Well, underpinning those private market swaps are central bank swaps, right? I mean, central bank swaps, because everyone in the global system knows that the Federal Reserve will be there in a crisis to provide dollars in massive amounts to anyone who wants them, then they think they can count on and investing in dollars and lending dollars, and more importantly, borrowing dollars, because they will have, if they borrow, then they'll have obligations coming due, and they want to make sure that they won't be caught short of liquidity, right? So those central banks, the Fed's willingness to do that is very important. Now, there are concerns, as you may be aware, that that maybe under this administration, the central bank swaps won't be there if markets go into another crisis. Bessent has issued statements saying we will have central bank. Fed Chair Powell has said we will. Don't worry, you can depend on us. But who gets to decide? You want to have you want dollars in a crisis? Well, maybe you'll have to give us Saskatchewan first, right? I mean, how reliable is anything that this administration says they'll do when there's such caprice and irrationality at the top? So I don't know if that's responsive to your question, but those swaps are very, the swap market is very important in providing liquidity to the whole dollar system, and the central bank swaps are a critical backstop for the whole shebang.
Okay, we've got one more along here. We do remember he has been up for about 97 hours, so I do want to get him caffeinated and rested for a little bit, but here we go.
This is sort of going back to the question before about if we were able to reindustrialize. I think I'm missing something. My understanding is that the US dollar dominance is sort of reliant on these imbalances, reliant on the fact that people are absorbing US debt. And I was wondering how a reindustrialization would maintain US dollar dominance, and sort of in line with that, what are the forces that are underpinning US dollar dominance to begin with? If not for the fact that we're just a consumption-led economy and able to sort of, import.
The fact that we have dollar dominance may certainly contributing to those imbalances, but I don't think it depends on those. The direction of causality is important here. So, one of the things that dollar dominance, I'd say probably the main thing dollar dominance depends on is confidence that the US economy will be able to generate sufficiently rising levels of goods and services so that the treasury obligations of the Treasury will be paid off on time and in full, and that when the Treasury needs to roll over those obligations, right, issue new debt to pay off old debt, that it will be able to do so at sustainable and continue to generate the goods and services that are needed to grow the tax base and pay off that debt. I'm not expressing this very articulately, but if those imbalances are unwound in a healthy way, I think that would be very good for dollar dominance. But
there would be less dollar assets in circulation, right? If you follow that logic, right? So they would be by definition less dominant, because obviously if China opened up and consumed more, there'd be more renminbi outside. People would actually have different things that they could hold as a savings asset. Rule of law held constant.
I'm not sure. That's okay. I see what you're saying. But if the US, there'd be less dollar asset. Not necessarily. The US, and this goes back to the Charlie Kindleberger argument, right? That you don't need to run a current account deficit to have the dominant currency. You need to be issuing safe assets. So if the US is healthy, and in the way that you're envisioning, right? I see no reason why why the amount of treasury assets being issued shouldn't be ample to provide enough liquid, safe, deep markets to handle all that international commerce that I talked about before. Now, in the long run, that can't be true. I mean, the U.S. we've got a new version of the Triffin dilemma coming up. Okay. Oh, you're not even. You're really teaching these kids. Wow.
One tries.
Because the U.S. is going to shrink as a share of the global economy over time. We hope. I mean, that'd be a good thing if other countries, catch up more, and right, that'll be good. The old cliche about in the long run we are all dead. I mean, you won't be, but I will. I can't think that far ahead. I'm too old.
Or alternatively, too jet lag. We've overtasked you already, Paul. Thank you very much for giving us the section.